I'm Amanda Joy Ravenhill. I'm honored to be Executive Director here at Buckminster Fuller Institute. We also have Faith and Jasmine. If you want to introduce yourselves.
I'm Faith. Yeah, great. I'm Faith Flanagan. I'm the Operations Director of the Buckminster Fuller Institute. I'm happy to have you all here as well.
I'm Jasmine Cable, the Community Manager at BFI, and happy to be here bright and early.
Again, welcome back to Trimtab Space Camp. Thank you so much for joining us. Space Camp is an opportunity for all of us to train up to be better astronauts on this living, breathing spaceship Earth and to be of the spaceship. We each week have a different framework or lens through which to look at this critical moment for humanity. This week we're learning from Charles Eisenstein, next week from Tony Patrick about world building, then from Bonnie DeVarco around synergetics and Buckminster Fuller's legacy, and finally from Stephen Brooks around permaculture. And we'll be discussing on the high-low in between and having activities that help us metabolize and ground the learning that we're getting from each of these modules. And we'll also have these office hours every week and happy hours, which is an opportunity for you all to connect to one another in a more informal setting. So Trimtab Space Camp is really, one of our main questions here is how big can you think? We see across a lot of different kind of mental models and these different forms of kind of cognitive scaffolding for understanding a new world, that seeing in context, how big can you think, how large in terms of temporal scale, geographic scale, sectoral scale, how big can you think and how wide a context you can consider will determine the kind of overall benefit and value that you can create for the world. If you're not considering all of those different contexts and scale, then an intention to do good could potentially just be pushing harm around the system and calling it good. Those unintended consequences are so often had because people aren't looking at the downstream effects or aren't looking at the root causes of what they're working on. And so Charles Eisenstein, you've been kind of in this same understanding of seeing everything as interconnected, a whole systems frame. One thing I always think about when I think of your work and your books is the myth of separation and how we're in this moment of potentially moving beyond that myth. So I was wondering if you could just open by speaking to that a little bit.
Yeah, well, thank you, Amanda. I think I'm gonna, instead of just baldly stating what I think that myth is, maybe I'll pick up on the metaphor of spaceship Earth. I'm trying to remember the initial, I have read the original context of that concept. Can you clue me in on what was the context when Bucky first mentioned spaceship Earth? Like, why did he present that metaphor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was in the 50s. And the idea was, one, to kind of show humanity that we're all united, we're all on one ship, and get that idea of kind of it's all or none, 100% of humanity, kind of a positive sum game dynamic of the world. And that borders, these political borders are really arbitrary, and man-made. And he would often say, like, if you took all the politicians and put them in orbit around the planet, nothing would really change all that much because the political system's so broken. And so right. I think a lot of it was about uniting humanity as one, and then considering just how like fabulously designed this spaceship is, all of these different life support systems, soil being, the stomach that digests photons into.
And in his time, science really had no idea actually of how complex soil is, or how complex Gaia wasn't even a concept. James Lovelock hadn't started formulating that, until 20 or 30 years after that. Right. So at that time, it really did look much more like Earth was a fantastically complicated machine rather than a complex system of multiple feedback loops and all of the stuff we know from cybernetics and complexity theory, it
Right.
looked a lot more like an intricately designed mechanism. And even from that viewpoint, the intricateness of it was still awe-inspiring. But I think that that ultimately the mechanical metaphors that inspired awe, they also present a limitation, and they risk us reducing something alive and infinitely complex into something that is mechanical and merely complicated. So I guess, and I'm not saying, okay, so we shouldn't use the term spaceship Earth or anything like that, but to
And that's
realize
why I always try to say living, breathing spaceship Earth whenever I mention it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But when we use terms like that, it's good to qualify it like that, or to at least to point to the limitations of those metaphors, because when we conceive or the sun as a nuclear furnace, if the sun is just a nuclear furnace, then boy oh boy are we lucky that the constants of nature aren't 1% different. Like if the strong force were 1% stronger than it is relative to the other forces, there would be no stars. The nuclear fusion wouldn't even be able to get going. And if it was 1% weaker, everything would explode. Like stars would have a lifespan of microseconds. So like this exquisite calibration that allows stars to last 10 billion years, it seems from a mindset of a mechanical universe, it seems that is just an incredibly lucky coincidence. But when we understand that systems evolve, even mathematical systems evolve toward complexity, and that stable phenomena emerge out of seemingly chaotic base conditions, then we start to appreciate that we are in a living universe. Hope that wasn't too big a jump, but just to say, like the sun, when you really study the sun, it is incredibly complex. It has, you can see even some of the images of these plumes of plasma, these whirls and pulses and filaments. And I mean, the thing is I heard one scientist say it's more like the electromagnetics of the sun are more complex than the electromagnetics of your brain. So this affirms the child's perception that the sun is alive. Every child knows that the sun is a being and not just something that appears like a being, but it is actually enormous ball of hydrogen fusing into helium. And the same thing with Earth. Earth is a being and not a mechanical device exquisitely designed by an external designer. That way of seeing them, it's interesting that the mechanical way of seeing necessitates an external divinity. It's part of the separation of God out from matter, because matter itself couldn't have these properties unless somebody designed them in. And as we understand that what looks like design can actually come from matter itself, that complex systems look as if they are designed, that intelligence emerges, that order emerges out of chaos, then we are open to a conception of God that isn't separate from matter, and the matter-spirit split that allows our civilization to treat matter as if it were just a bunch of unsacred stuff closes, and we are in touch with the sacred in the mundane. And I think that through his pioneering work in complexity, Buckminster Fuller is one of the forerunners of this shift of consciousness that re-embraces matter. And so as for separation, this is one of the main pillars of separation between matter and spirit. And so that's one of the inroads, and this is actually personal to me. Like, this is how one of the main inroads that launched me into what I'm doing today. When I first came across the Mandelbrot set in what year was that? 1990. Yeah, a friend gave me a book by Ilya Prigogine that was what was it? I think it was Order Out of Chaos, actually, by Prigogine and Stengers. And I saw my first images of the Mandelbrot set, and it permanently blew my mind, like more than the first acid trip I had, which was around that time as well. Like, the Mandelbrot set was much more of a trip than that, because I was like, hold on. And I don't know if any of you guys have gone into these Mandelbrot Zooms. You can find them online, like on YouTube, like these. I don't even know if everybody knows what the Mandelbrot set is, but it's an iconic object at this point. It's a mathematical object that is infinitely complex. It's a fractal. It's the mother of all fractals, and you zoom into one little part of it, and there's new structures that become visible the more deeply you zoom in, and it's endless. And I'm like, no artist designed this. This is just part of reality. If this is beauty without an artist, design without a designer, and if this happens in mathematics, all the more does it happen in physics and biology. In other words, the universe is alive. So that for me was a profound reunion that I am no longer, I or we as humans, we're no longer marooned in a dead universe of force and mass and atoms and void, but we are in a living universe. We are life within life within life within life. We are at home in the universe. So yeah, that's one one dimension of the transition from separation and the mythology of separation into a new story.
Thank you. Yeah, two pieces that come to mind there around Fuller's work is one, he wrote a book called No More Secondhand God, which has a similar thesis to what you were just saying, of kind of the sacred being everything, and not kind of, putting it out a second order, but acknowledging that it's within all of us and within everything. And then the other is a term that Fuller, kind of similar to synergy, took from an obscure science, which was the idea of syntropy. So, entropy being the tendency toward disorder, syntropy is at once kind of the opposite of it, of like the tendency toward kind of more order, but also more complexity. And it also includes some of that like birth, death, decay cycle in it, like a living system does. It has kind of that healthy churn and digestion that happens. So yeah, two pieces within Fuller's legacy that kind of speak to what you were talking to. Conspiracy myth essay been received?
I don't know, because I have just stayed away from comments because people are so mean.
Oh dear.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think it's received well. I think a lot of people don't know what to make of it, though.
Yeah. It doesn't fit into people's ideas.
Yeah, because in general, my sympathies lie with those who are questioning and doubting the official narratives.
Dare to, Fuller always said, dare to be naive, dare to kind of
Mhm.
think differently and think for yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, but a lot of those folks, like I'm on some, highly conspiratorial chats and stuff, and a lot of them, I think I'm like a little bit suspect because it's like, I thought you were on our side,
There's so much, radicalization and tribalism happening right now. And like wearing a mask being a political statement or not is just
I know.
atrocious. It's so scary. How did we get here? Come on, humanity. We're more brilliant than that.
Sylvester McMonkey McBean maybe was right after all.
Oh, I don't know who that is.
Yeah. If you don't have children, do you, Amanda?
No, I don't. It's a
So
children's
if
book.
you did, you
I
would have read them.
do.
You would have read them, The Sneetches by Dr. Seuss.
Yes.
And Sylvester McMonkey McBean is the one who comes and sells the Sneetches, the star off and star on machines. Remember that? Have you ever read that story? Really, like a few of his stories, it's actually a profound allegory that works on multiple levels. It works as a children's story. It works as a political allegory. It works as a spiritual allegory. And so in the story, there's two kinds of Sneetches on the beaches. They're like these kind of big penguin kind of birds, and some of them have stars on their bellies and others don't. And the ones who have stars, they're like the upper class. They don't let the plain belly Sneetches join their Frankfurter roasts or picnics or parties or marshmallow toasts. They never invited the plain belly Sneetches, just left them alone in the dark of the beaches, sitting there wishing their bellies had stars. And then Sylvester McMonkey McBean comes along, and he says, I've heard of your troubles. I've heard you're unhappy, but I can fix that. I'm the fix-it-up chappie. I've come here to help you. I have what you need, and my prices are low, and I work with great speed, and my work is 100% guaranteed. And then they pay $3 each to go through his star on machine, and they come out and their bellies have stars. And then they're like, haha, we're just as good as you now. And then he goes up and whispers to the originally star-bellied Sneetches and says, belly stars are no longer in style. What you need is my trip through the star off machine. So then they get their stars off and they said, now we're the best Sneetch. And then I'm telling this way longer than I need to, but as you can guess, what happens is that everyone starts going through both machines, and when every last cent of their money was spent, the fix-it-up chappie packed up and he went, and he laughed as he drove in his car down the beach. No, they never will learn. No, you can't teach a Sneetch. And it ends, but McBean was quite wrong. I'm quite happy to say that the Sneetches got really quite smart on that day. And they learned that there's no kind of Sneetch that's the best on the beaches. And so, the Sneetches learn their lesson. But sometimes, as far as polarization goes, I just wonder if maybe Sylvester McMonkey McBean, with his cynical attitude about Sneetch nature, might have been right after all. So that was the reference anyway.
I love it.
In moments of despair, that's where I go.
And all the radicalization that's been happening for the last 7 or 8 years, however you want to define it.
Yeah, this is not new. This is to be expected.
Yeah.
The field has been primed for obsessive hygiene, for distancing, for suspicion, the war against the other, the war against the German, the war against Trump, and the war against the liberals, and the war against the conservatives, all the same war.
Yeah.
Like all of this is inevitable from the ground of war thinking.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about just like, how do we, it's a refrain that we talk about at BFI quite a bit, but like, how do you solve problems while dissolving the root causes that led to them? like looking at the systems implications of what
Yeah.
what drivers led to this, or what drivers are exacerbating it. And obviously there's mutual causal feedback loops, and it's not all that simple, but
Yeah. Yeah.
how
It kind
can
of,
we solve this while also looking at these, you know, to dissolve the othering, the radicalization, the fear mongering.
makes me question a bit Buckminster Fuller's most famous quote, you know, about building a new model. Because what happens when the new model is persecuted, and like what's happening now with alternative medicine. You know, my wife is a healer, acupuncturist. I mean, people were coming to her until she got shut down with medically incurable diseases, and they were routinely getting cured. But she's, you know, non-essential, and like all the chiropractors are shut down. All of the acupuncturists are shut down in this state, at least. So they built a better model, but sometimes the better model gets destroyed. So I think that
because it's a threat, or it just
Yeah.
doesn't fit into the profiteering. You know,
Right.
what makes sense with a C is like whatever's the most lucrative. Tom Chi and I were talking the other day, and we're like, it's just ridiculous that we have probably thousands of military satellites and not a one for soil.
Wow.
Like, if you were to design what reasons you would want satellites, wouldn't there be more for life than for competition and death? But it's all about what's lucrative.
Yeah.
So there's a question here around cognitive biases, and that kind of came up before people went out into their breakout groups. Langdon, do you want to speak to that from your group?
I can do it. Hi. Hi, Charles. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everybody. And so, you know, I love the way that, you know, you address, you know, cognitive bias and, you know, try to create a lot of balance. And, you know I have cognitive biases, we all do. Even the approach of trying to keep balance in everything is a cognitive bias. So I'm wondering, what do you do on a consistent basis to try to ensure that you become aware of your own cognitive biases and that they don't creep into your writing?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Yeah, I don't think the goal is to be without cognitive biases, but is to be, or to think that we can be aware of all of our cognitive biases. But it's a growth process, it's a learning process whereby, and that's how it is for me, where biases that I was not aware of become visible. And so it's it unfolds over time. So, like I said, a learning process. So it comes, that growth is possible when we're not attached, when we become clear about our motives for speaking, when we become aware of the psychological rewards that we associate with being right. Attachment to being right actually is the biggest impediment to becoming aware of our cognitive biases. Why do we want to be right? Why do we become attached to our beliefs? It's actually no big mystery. Our schooling conditions us to rewards for being right. And then there's also even a deeper evolutionary aspect to it, where human beings evolved for group harmony. I was just reading some anthropology, paleoanthropology, about Neanderthals. You know, Neanderthals actually had bigger brains than Homo sapiens, much bigger. They were smarter than us, probably smarter than us, but they weren't so good in at working in groups. Their social cohesion, their ability to organize and cooperate was, at least according to this theory, far inferior to ours. Now, I don't necessarily buy into the whole, okay, boy, this is going to go on a long tangent, so I'm not going to go into that more than I just did. But so we have an operating system where we look around to see what other people's opinions are in our tribe, in our in-group, and as a gesture of harmony, social conformity, social courtesy, we display those opinions and identify with those opinions. It's a way to define the group. And I guess if you're living in a culture where the prevailing norms and beliefs are aligned with a beautiful society and ecological harmony, and the social cohesion is serving that society, then this is a really good feature of human beings. However, that that human nature can get co-opted by powers that are not friendly to human well-being, shall we say. And I'm not necessarily talking about evil people, manipulative people, although that happens too. But systems can co-opt our natural proclivity to agree. So anyway, but to get back, I mean, it's not, you know, I mean, I think many people here are quite familiar with various kinds of cognitive bias. For me, it's just, it's almost a mantra. Why do I believe this? For real, like for real. If I encounter some study that implicates 5G in some kind of health condition, like there's part of me that's like, I knew it. I knew that was bad. Like, what part of me delights in that? What part of me accepts that uncritically and is highly suspicious of another research paper that says 5G is not a problem, or that, you know, microwave radiation is not a problem? What is it my clear thinking and my survey of all of the evidence and the cold application of dispassionate reason that has brought me to that? Honestly, no. I was predisposed to begin with. So why? It's, and so I'm telling my story here, but maybe, you know, different people have a different story. But for me, why? It's like, wow, I am defiant. I distrust authority. And so anything that challenges authority, I'm naturally friendly to. So let me be aware of this. That doesn't mean that the dissidents are wrong simply because I am sympathetic to them for non-rational reasons. Doesn't mean that they're wrong, but it doesn't mean that they're right either. So then if I'm aware of this predilection toward defiance, then I have a better chance to separate that out when I'm taking in the information. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that is helpful. And if people haven't seen it, I just put a link into the Cognitive Bias Codex, which is a really great kind of mandala of different cognitive biases out there. It's good to kind of poke around in there every once in a while and remember all the different ways. And then Jamie Joyce, who's here, one of our participants in Trimtab Space Camp, is always ready to talk about different ones. Great. So there's a question, there's a common thread here from Tim Archer's group and Stephen Bow's group and Jenny Stefanati and Brett Ann around kind of like, what is the Trimtab moment here? What is the Trimtab to get us beyond the story of separation? What is the Trimtab moment kind of for that building the new model that makes the old obsolete? And then Stevens was specifically around kind of like the Trimtab around changing the media system, which is designed for misinformation. And Tim was more about, what's necessary for better behavior to emerge from this like liminal state, from this transition state. where the control over human systems is becoming less effective at producing viable outcomes. Brett Ann, I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit to your position on what you guys were thinking about in terms of coming back to a Trimtab.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. So, I mean, I copied down a couple things from the group. We went a few different directions, but mostly it's coming back to wanting to know, like, what's the leverage point? Like, some of us work in philanthropy, some of us work in networking, various things around the world, some are in permaculture stuff, but like, if we're all going to get together with our rainbow of skills, like, what should we collectively focus on next? Or is it a decentralized something, or just more direction on, like, where are the really high-end trim tabs that will move the biggest rudders?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, I don't know the answer to that question. And I kind of wish that more people wouldn't know the answer to that question. Because generally speaking, it's this mindset of, okay, here's the most important thing. Here's the biggest leverage point. Here's what not only I need to be doing, but what you need to be doing to save the world. Otherwise, nothing else matters. Or here is the highest impact acupuncture point. There's a lot of people proposing those, and they are not in agreement with each other. And so what do we make of that? Like, you look into any one of them and it seems that they can make a compelling case. But overall, I think when people universalize their particular cause, which is happening most, like the obvious example is climate change, then you gotta wonder, such an easy, ready solution, has that really gone through the long journey in between the old story and the new story? Or is it kind of what Amanda was saying before, like pushing the problem onto another area? Is this response, this quote solution, actually coming from the same mindset as the problem is coming from? Is it like the most available, easy? So this is in COVID-19, this is another example of it, where, oh my God, we've got to do something right now. And so from that hurry mentality, what we do right now is what we already know how to do. And we apply the mindsets that are already familiar to us, which is some version of control. Find something to control. And this is in climate change as well. Find something to control, CO2. When we're in a systems thinking, when we're in a systems view, then you cannot reduce a problem to the one thing that you can control. When you're dealing with a living organism, control of, like, to separate all the variables, to find the causative variable, to control that variable, that doesn't work. You can't separate variables. The whole idea of an independent variable is questionable. It's a rare exception and not the rule when you're looking at living systems. So that, right. So basically, boy, I've gone on a long route here, but just to say, I think that we have to learn. I mean, really what this question is about is how do we identify right action? And maybe a place to start is to question the question. This generic you as what should you be doing? Or this we, what should we be doing? Well, who is that? Maybe each of us have been inserted into a particular node in the matrix where our particular passions and gifts are exactly what's needed there. And this question of what is the best thing for us to be doing right now could that be an escape from something that you actually already know? What from pre-rational or trans-rational sources of knowledge that direct you toward the most useful contribution that you could be making? Which isn't to say that the rational sources of knowledge are not important, but they can, like your knowledge about the world, you're reading about whatever problem that we're facing, but those can feed in to a trans-rational or pre-rational organism that then guides you through the call of the heart toward what you really care about. And that's what you should be doing. And that changes over time as new rational information comes in. So you originally thought that and what impassioned you was to build schools for those poor people who don't have schools in Africa. And then new information comes in, which is that these schools are actually destroying their traditional ways of life. And then maybe what your heart calls you to do changes. But I personally don't need a meta-historical or meta-narrative about the whole world or the whole universe so that I can reason from first principles as to what the most effective action is. That said, okay, that was just a long disclaimer. Anything that comes from and contributes to the understanding of interconnection, interdependency, and interbeing, whether we're talking about soil and forests or community, social systems, transcending war mentality, anything that undermines the pillars of the prevailing narratives is especially important. So, yeah, that's.
I think it's a good segue into Andrea and Seth Bunting's questions around just like story. Well, I'll just let you speak to it. Seth or Andrea, do you want to speak to what you were, what your questions were there?
Yeah, Andrea, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So I kind of view the story of interbeing as another story or truth lens we can choose. And to someone else who's in the story of separation, their truth seems very real. So I was wondering if you've had any experience or maybe even strategies on how you connect and reach out and touch people in completely different stories to try to communicate and enroll, maybe even enroll them or open up the possibilities. And the implications of that question itself would be, if your truth is almost meeting another truth, is there like a battle of truth? Is there an objective truth? And is there a potential tyranny in the idea of even trying to enroll someone in your truth? Because that's also a warring mentality.
Right. That's actually the old story. That's domination and conquest. So it's really good to be aware of that and to take a different approach, which is to orient toward the invitation from that when you sense that the story that somebody is in is no longer serving them, that they're chafing at the bit, that they're confined by that story, and that there's a part of them that would welcome an entree into an expanded story. That's the time to speak. So it's really honoring and trusting the other person. And I think what's happening in our time is that the story of separation that has carried this society for hundreds of years or more is like a story or a myth. I mean, I really would say, I think a myth is a better word for it than a story. A myth not being the same as a fantasy or delusion, but myths carry truth. The myth that has carried our society that we've inhabited it's a being. Myths are beings, stories are beings, and it's getting old. They evolve too. And it is, it once was tremendously liberating, say like the story of scientific reductionism and objectivity, liberated many people from old religious authorities and dogmas. What was once liberating now is confining. So those who are oppressed and confined by that story, and who are ready to move on to a different story, or even more, like people who have experienced the collapse of the story that told them what the world was and who they are and how to be healthy and how to be successful, and they followed instructions. And instead of being healthy and successful, they ended up with $100,000 of student debt and no job and a health problem that the doctors say is their imagination. Like those people, the old story is not working for them. And then you can bring a new story as an offering or some element of that new story. Not everybody has to be a philosopher and say, okay, so the nature of the self is this, but the offering might be, hey, have you heard about the idea that germs are a symptom of a diseased tissue state, you know? Or, hey, I went to my chiropractor and like there's an openness when the old story is not working, and it's not working for more and more people. So we can look at ourselves more as greeters and hosts for refugees from the old story and from the systems that were built on that old story that aren't working anymore. And then there's, I guess, and to just add one more thing, it's a kind of a messy process, the transition from stories. So one thing that we can do is simply offer breadcrumbs to a new story. And by the way, like I'm framing this in terms of us and them, those who are in the new story, those in the old story, but actually everyone is a mix. And so what I'm saying also applies to those parts of yourself that are very comfortable in the old story, or maybe not comfortable in the old story, but still attached to it. And what if I'm wrong? And what if I'm just being naive? And like there's parts of ourselves too that will benefit from these breadcrumbs. And the breadcrumbs are just simply experiences that we can give another person that don't fit into the story of separation. An experience of kindness, generosity, compassion, love, courage. If your lens is a universe of selfish competitors, each seeking to maximize their self-interest, these data points don't make sense. They help undermine the story of separation. Even humor, that on some level telegraphs it's not that serious, and we're in this together because we laugh together. Like there's a common humanity that humor can access when nothing else can. So yeah, those are the two things that I would offer. One being to see ourselves as greeters and hosts, responding to an invitation, and then the other is to sow the seeds, because it's not just a push out of the old story as it collapses, but it's also a pull. All of the beautiful experiences and projects and ideas and people that show us that there's another world bigger than the one that we're used to.
Thank you for that. So yeah, I think a huge trend that more and more of us are seeing right now is racial inequality. And that's a question from Steve Brandt, just like how is the old story kind of continuing to propagate structural racism? And yeah, Steve, do you want to speak a little bit more to that about what your question is there for Charles?
Thanks very much. Charles, it's an honor to get to ask you about this, because I believe we are in a living system. And I believe that system contains a poison that is potentially capable of killing at least the human component, if that's the proper word. It's the human element of the system. The system may continue, but the humanity piece may die off and fall away, and like some appendage that we once had. I think we all had tails. If you went back a couple of million years, we don't have tails anymore, but we've got a tailbone. So that's the remnant. So I'm wondering if you could talk about your view of the origin and the root cause of the poison, and what you think could be done to cure the illness. Thanks very much for your insight.
Yeah, well, thank you. I don't think that it's likely that human beings are going to perish on Earth. I think it's more likely that Earth will perish and human beings won't. There's a future that I call the concrete world, where we grow all of our food with precision fermentation and animal cell cultures in giant laboratories, and maybe vegetables in hydroponics factories, in which we modulate the Earth's temperature with geoengineering, where the whole planet is one large strip mine and garbage dump, where we have bubble cities and personal bubbles to protect ourselves from an environment that has been made toxic. Like, you can feel that future.
It's depicted in the movie WALL-E.
Yeah, WALL-E, that's right. But as for this poison, and there's, you didn't mention racism, but Amanda did, which is as good a gateway into it as any. The root field of racism is dehumanization. It's the habit of making other people into less than fully human. One expression of that is racism, and there are many other expressions too. Fundamentally, any judgment is a form of dehumanization. War necessitates dehumanization. You have to reduce people to a caricature of a full human, into an enemy. But even judgment, to say, well, if I were that person, I wouldn't be doing that. I'm made of, like, why wouldn't you? Is it that you're just made of better stuff? Is it that you are more fully a self with the capacities of a self than they are? You are morally and intellectually superior, so therefore you wouldn't do such a thing. I mean, what are you really saying when you're saying, I wouldn't have done that? It is a reduction of that person. And when we apply that to our political opponents, we make them basically irremediable, so that the only solution possible is to dominate them in some way, to win. And I'll even say that a lot of anti-racism work actually also encodes forms of dehumanization. When we blame racism on racists, when, as Amanda mentioned, the racism is systemic. And when people enter racist systems, even if they didn't start out with racial hatred, they can acquire it because it's built into the system. And now there's also an economic dimension where basically racism facilitates the current economic system because there has to be an underclass. There has to be some way to explain why some people are better off than others, or to justify it. One way historically to justify it has been, well, those people are inferior. That's why they're less successful. So again, racism becomes like the handmaiden of capitalism. And ultimately, it's at home in a system that even without racism, it still reduces people to consumers and producers. And in an industrial system, it is necessary for people to take their place in the machine and to perform machine functions, which now that's all changing.
Yeah.
And that would be a longer conversation, but
there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
I just want to note that we're at the top of the hour. Some people might need to go now onto other things. So you do. Thank you so much for joining us. and for those who can stick around, we'll continue on. There's a book called A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things that talks about a number of things that you just mentioned, Charles, about cheap labor and cheap food, and kind of how the kind of modern industrialized economy requires that there's kind of these structural elements in order for the wealthy to get more wealthy, to get more wealthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the reduction, I'll just add one more mini sentence, which is just that this mentality of reducing the sacred to something less is not only applied onto human beings, but also onto nature, onto other beings, onto animals, onto plants, onto the world, and through scientific ideology, onto all of matter, where it becomes less than a being. That's what happens when your primary tool is analysis. You understand something by breaking it down into its parts. But when you break something down into a tiny unit and you cut it off from all of its associations with everything else, i.e. when you take a sample, remove it from its context in nature and bring it to a lab, you've already reduced it. You've already denied its interbeingness. So we have a corollary of reduction of racism built into like our primary scientific postulates, our primary scientific axioms about what the world is and how to gain knowledge. So you can see how thoroughgoing the revolution that we are in is, and why it might take a long time, and why there are parts of us that are still in the old story without even knowing it, and how these produce cognitive biases that are going to take a long time for us to fully excavate. We're just like toe deep in the ocean of a new age.
Yeah, that actually speaks really well to the next question from, if you have a little bit more time, Charles, from Richard Ramsey's group around just like why weren't a lot of the discoveries of and realizations of Buckminster Fuller and Lovelock and others, why haven't they gained more popularity? You know, obviously there's gestation periods, as you just said, and like that's how Bucky used to refer to it. Like part of the reason he was so excited about synergy was because it was a word that described what we now know of as emergence. But he was like, we don't even have a word for like the idea that there's something unpredictable that can happen when you put two pieces together, or when you look at them in relationship. There were, similar with Gaia theory and Lovelock's work, all of these realizations of the 20th century that just like haven't been woven into kind of our day-to-day culture. So Richard, does that summarize the question well in terms of why hasn't it been picked up? Anything more to add there?
Hello, it's Richard here. Charles, what I was getting at is that in my work at the University of Calgary in social work, I got introduced to the work of Poincaré, Pergolesi, the chaos theory people, Lovelock, etc. I wrote a paper some years ago saying that our discipline was on the verge of becoming a full century behind the new knowledge because it was stuck into the old mechanical reductionist point of view. So this is part of my question is, how come all of these new things that have come out in the 20th century have never taken hold in any of our educational systems, whether it's the elementary all the way up to the highest of higher education, in a mainstream kind of way?
Yeah. I mean, they are starting to take hold a little bit, but yeah, they were not at home in the zeitgeist. And of the 20th century was the culminating age of the story of separation. And it had to, that story had to go to its extreme and into its full expression before it was ready to give way to something else. And that process had not yet been fulfilled in the 20th century. And maybe today, maybe it still hasn't quite been fulfilled. Maybe there are still realms of separation that we haven't explored yet. But certainly in the 20th century, we were not ready for a lot of the knowledge that Bucky Fuller was bringing forth, and people even more radical than him. There are just huge realms of technology that are verboten, that are, and even like you look on Wikipedia, you look up acupuncture on Wikipedia or homeopathy, it will say as a statement of fact that this is pseudoscience and quackery, because it doesn't fit into it doesn't fit into what the axioms of the universe that are accepted by science, at least science as an institution. So of course they seem ridiculous. How could chemically pure water convey information? Now, in fact, there is a lot of heterodox science that demonstrates exactly that, but it just doesn't fit into the paradigm, into the reigning paradigm. So as the paradigm ages and becomes infirm and its immune system stops working so well, then these foreign DNA, these other data points, these other realms of knowledge can get in. And I think that's what's happening now. But given how everything alternative has been swept aside in the COVID-19 response, like you don't hear the CDC or the WHO saying, wow, look at decades of research that demonstrate that meditation and yoga boost your immune system. We better tell everybody to do that. You don't hear that they're not saying that. So it's like right now we're exploring what happens when we double down on the story of separation and exclude all of this stuff. So maybe we're not done yet. But anyway, am I clear? Like what, like these other, Bucky Fuller's discoveries, I mean, some of them fit pretty well into the story of separation, and some of them totally didn't. And the ones that did fit got accepted. And he is celebrated by, conventional sources as a genius for those things. And the things that don't fit in, those are ignored. Same thing going back to Nikola Tesla. The stuff that doesn't fit is ignored. And I would like to think that times are changing now, and that the stuff that didn't fit the paradigm and was therefore ignored and suppressed has room now to come in. But I guess we're not quite there yet.
Well, I think one good example is the story of Poincaré, who made the discovery, I believe it was, of sort of fractals, but he didn't believe it. He could not accept that he made this kind of discovery, so he denied it and suppressed it. And it really took, I think, until Mandelbrot and others many years later to actually surface something that was accurate, but outside the, as you say, the paradigm of what was acceptable. So I think there's probably still an awful lot in all of us that we keep denying what it is that is being put in front of us, and our educators are unwilling to put that information inside curricula so that we can all explore it and understand and learn from it.
Yeah,
and it's systemic. For me, it's systemic. It's Bucky's idea that we have to stop saying sunsets and sunrises. We have to stop saying up and down when we know the reality is quite different than that. But no one has changed the language in the world to represent that kind of reality. If we won't even do that, why would we accept all this other new stuff? Let's stay with the the belief in separation. Let's stay with the antithesis of what David Bohm wrote about in his work.
Yeah, well, there's a long way to go.
Right.
But even, yeah, okay. Anyway, could say more, but we are a bit over time, I guess.
Yeah. Do you have time for one more, or should we wrap it up?
I'll do one more.
All right. Yeah, this last question is from Casey House, who is a brilliant artist, inspired by Bucky's work and continuing the work of synergetics, about othering and maybe what benefit othering could have. But Casey, I'll let you explain it.
Well, thank you, Amanda. Charles, I think we're actually wearing the same shirt, which
yeah.
I designed your shirt there. Yep.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. I like this shirt.
Thank you for wearing it. That's inspiring. So my question has to do with Bucky's idea of interaccommodation and how we can see otherness as an integral part of our healthy development, and begin to see how other perspectives can lead us to new realizations and build systems that have that as a fundamental part of the process. So do you see a way that we can build this consideration of otherness and new perspectives as a valuable part of our development? And how I guess the base of that question is like, how do you see the systems of the future adopting or building into its foundations an ability to adapt and change and allow for new perspectives to inform us?
So I think there's like a lot of questions in there. I'm not sure how to answer without like sounding super theoretical. So let me just.
Yeah, okay. I can just kind of narrow it down. Like how can otherness play a vital role in our societal development?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I guess one way to respond to that is that so it's not that there is no other and that it's all one. That's not what I'm saying. It's more that the other always shows us something about ourselves as well, and that when we come across something that seems radically other, radically unfamiliar, incomprehensible, or that disturbs and disrupts our understanding of the world, that means that we are being invited to grow. And we can ask, what undiscovered part of ourself is being revealed by the appearance of a new other? So, I mean, this could be in, could take the form of even like ideas that seem foreign, that are sometimes offensively foreign. What are they showing us? What alienated part of ourselves are they co-resonating with if they would come into our field? So maybe an example of that. I mean, to get back to the conspiracy myth, that essay I wrote and put out maybe a week ago. Like most people would scoff and ridicule some of these conspiracy theories and dismiss them, but that emotional reaction to them, where is that coming from? And what might these theories be telling us or trying to tell us? Like, they are an example of an other. They don't fit into the story of self and the story of the world that most people carry. So what are they showing us that we were not aware of before? That's the orienting question that I would offer in engaging what we see as other. Like a lot of people, especially if they're, you know, on the political left and very well educated in inclusivity and so forth, what is other to them isn't what they are calling other. What is other to them are the things that really offend them and seem inexcusable and incomprehensible. That's the other, the incomprehensible, the thing that offends what you think is good and right and the way things are. That's the other. And that is what invites us into growth. The growth doesn't usually mean, oh, they were right, those things that offend and disturb me, but they're showing me something. What is it? To take that attitude of curiosity rather than the war mentality of shutting them out, shutting them down.
That's exactly, yeah, what I was getting at is like how the curiosity, inviting curiosity into the relationship. And I think that's exactly it right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's been a common thread through, I think, almost every one of our modules of Trimtab Space Camp, as we keep on coming back to curiosity and humility, and being inspired by nature in both of those. I think we're going to wrap it up here. Charles, you're getting lots of thanks in the chat here. I'm not sure if you're watching that, but people are so grateful for your work, for your books, for your essays, and for sharing your time with us today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Really appreciate you. Thanks for thinking for yourself and encouraging all of us to think for ourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda, and thank you, everybody else.
Thank you, Charles.